Peter R. Breggin, MD, is called the conscience of psychiatry for his many decades of successful reform efforts. His scientific and educational work provide the foundation for modern criticism of drugs and ECT and lead the way in promoting more caring and effective therapies. His books include Talking Back to Prozac, Toxic Psychiatry, Medication Madness, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and now, Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety, Understanding and Overcoming Negative Emotions. Welcome to the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour.
Oh, and welcome, my wonderful, wonderful, wonderful audience. This is the second show on the radio that will become a TV show. It's being filmed as we speak. You can only listen to it live on the radio, but in a couple of days, you'll find it on my YouTube channel, which you can get to just by Breggin YouTube, or you can get to off of my website where you'll see links to the radio show. This is just, rather to the TV show, this is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. We're getting the kinks out of it. And my first show last week went up just a day ago, but this one will go up very quickly. It's a wonderful thing. I'm actually going to be talking to you with me, myself, on the camera, and my guests. Whether I have one, two, or three, they'll be coming in separately and joining. It's a TV show. And remember, you can watch it on the about 1 to 2 days after the live radio show. And of course, this is wonderful PRN. And it's 4 o'clock New York time, if you want to know, and you're tuning in at some odd hour for the live radio, November 13th, 2019. Welcome aboard. My guest today is someone familiar on the radio. He's a dear friend. We just feel kind of like soulmates. We've been through a kind of a similar history over the years. His name is Mykos Cornwall. Mykos a PhD psychologist. He's a clinician. He has worked many decades in the public sector. He knows a lot about the worst of psychiatry. He knows a lot about helping people who really seem beyond help. You know, folks who are coming into the public system. Not like my work, where even though the people coming to see me might be really, really disturbed, they at least have intact families because they're coming to, by that I mean at least one member of a family who's a caring, relating person and wants to do their best, or they wouldn't be coming to see me. Michael has to see adults and children with very little loving, caring, supportive backup. And so we'll get to talk about that and how we work. Michael is also the director of our new project, which is the it's called Stop the Psychiatric Abuse of Children. Stop the Psychiatric Abuse of Children. And he'll tell you more about that as we get going. Michael, welcome to the second radio TV show of the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour. Good to see you, my friend.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here.
You look good. You look good. It's fun to be seeing you.
You do too.
Just talking to you on the radio. It seems more intimate. I feel warmer. I think I'm going to come across both on the radio and the TV as more of myself because I like relating. I like seeing somebody I'm talking to, and this feels a lot better. You were telling me on our pre-interview that you're glad to see the CDC is starting to recognize some more of the importance of trauma. I checked that out, and I put up sometime in the next hour, we certainly should have up something from the CDC recognizing the frequency of childhood trauma and its impact on adulthood. And I may not have gotten what you saw, and I'll be checking out what you send in too. So talk to folks about that and why it's so important.
Well, I think it's really significant. I'd say it's quite late in the game for them to do their first announcement of the the effects of childhood trauma
Yeah.
on children and then throughout a person's life. It was just recently announced by the CDC that they've now apparently done some research, which, as you know, our friend John Reed, who's been on your show from the UK, who's done this decades-long work on what they call adverse childhood experiences, that now the CDC is actually using that language, adverse childhood experiences, and how for childhood and teens and then all through adulthood. I was just looking at that, and they even have made the statement that it reduces the risk if there's prevention for conditions that they identify as asthma, cancer, depression, diabetes, and more. So I think it's significant that at this point in time, the CDC, that is usually, I think, biased towards the brain neuroscience model, is actually coming out and putting emphasis on the effects of trauma and childhood trauma.
Now, they're probably not connecting cancer and diabetes to childhood trauma, but are they connecting it to prevention, like diet and things like that, and exercise? What's going on there, do you think?
They didn't spell out the equation there, but they were saying if there is prevention of childhood trauma, those specific diseases would be lessened. So I need to dig down more into the research.
Yeah, let's dig down more, and we'll have a show that looks more at that too with you at a later date, and get that to me. So that'll be interesting to follow up on. It would be pretty spectacular to have the CDC coming out and suggesting that there are psychological factors, which I'm not even sure about, in the later development of diabetes and say cancer. I'm not sure about that at all. So that'll be interesting. I mean, to somebody who's not aware of what goes on in our field very much, it might not seem so surprising or important that a government agency is recognizing childhood adverse events. But folks, psychiatry has become such an advocate of drugs, the drug companies, and rigid adult diagnoses and even rigid childhood diagnoses, that it has no ability now to look at what are the events that might have made somebody depressed and might be making them depressed now, because that would interfere with how the average psychiatrist, as well as the average prescriber, whatever their background, how they work. So your nurse practitioner, your pediatrician, your physician's assistant, if they're working with a prescriber or can prescribe, all these folks are spending 10 to 15 minutes max with patients. And I think psychiatrists are trying to get in 6 an hour because they get to do these med checks, which will provide them with an income that they believe is commensurate to their training. Whereas if they put in that they were doing psychotherapy, then they would be getting a much less amount of money. And also they'd have to know so much more. I mean, drugs, they don't know anything about drugs. They just give them out. I mean, I see these guys in deposition in my legal work, and you ask them simple questions about pharmacology or psychopharmacology. They don't know the answers. You ask them simple questions about what is tardive dyskinesia. They say things like, oh, it's a rare disorder, when the patient they may be giving the drugs to, like Abilify or Seroquel or Risperdal or Geodon, and this person's over 55, they got a 20% risk a year cumulative. They're going to get a 40% risk in 2 years, and they're saying it's rare. And the young people they're giving it to have a 5 to 8% a year cumulative rate of getting abnormal movements. That's what tardive dyskinesia is. It also has other elements. It can lead to dementia, can upset your autonomic nervous system. But, mainly the people notices the distortions of the neck, the blinking of the eyes, the grimacing, the abnormal gait, and so on. And they're telling patients it's rare, and the young, healthy person who's getting the drug has 5 to 8% a year cumulative rate. So in 3 years, it's up to 15 and 24% cumulative. So they don't know anything, but they can just give the drugs and not bother doing any of the real checkups they should do on patients. But they're making money. They're making more than the family docs are, and the primary care people, they're the specialists. They can't do it except by pushing drugs because they can't compete. They don't want to be in competition with the social workers and the psychologists and the counselors who are willing to work for less. So they don't do therapy anymore, so they don't know about childhood trauma. They have no idea there's a correlation between childhood trauma and psychosis. So I'm doing a lot of talking. Pick up on this theme for me.
Well, that's part of the tragic story. They began with the assumption that it's all somehow biogenetic or in the brain. And it's such a simplistic, in my experience, untrue assertion. And then from there, they prescribe the drugs, and then often the effects of the drugs and how it impacts people for life and even shortens their life. We know that the average person who gets these major psychiatric diagnoses, totally documented, lives 20 to 25 years less than national average. So there's huge negligence there, but I think kind of the fundamental underlying whole superstructure is built on that belief that, on the question, is something wrong with you or did something happen to you? And so I think for the CDC to come out and say, actually, things have happened to us. And when we're children, when we're adults, and they affect us emotionally, they affect us, our lives. And so I think that's kind of a huge divide for me, especially working in that public mental health system for 28 years, alongside psychiatrists every day, part of the treatment team. Even those docs there who, could have been in private practice, maybe making more, they just believed what they'd been taught. They believed what every APA convention reinforced, what every drug rep told them, what NAMI pressured them to believe. And so I would always go in and go, well, let's look at, what's the backstory to this young person's experience? There's always, you wrote that article for the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, among many others, about what they used to call what are the functional aspects of this person's distress? What are the real life events and traumas? So when they start from that, ignoring that, and I think that's kind of the watershed there, then everything gets built on that. Everything that follows comes from that huge error. I think that's going to be, 50, 100 years from now, when they look back on this era, they'll see, people like you who said, wait a minute, you're missing the whole thing here. It's not what you say it is. It's not a disease. Because they believe it is, even these well-meaning psychiatrists who are in public service, I could never talk them out of it. I had one child psychiatrist actually break down in tears and tell me, Michael, I hate prescribing Abilify for this 5-year-old little girl, but I have to because I was taught at one of the best medical schools in the country in my psychiatric residency that every second someone is in one of these extreme states, they're undergoing irreversible brain damage. And I say, well, look at all these studies I can show you. She said, I'd like to believe you, but I can't. And so that's what 90% of people who go for help are faced with that. The true believers, they're the docs and the pediatricians and now the family practitioners and physician's assistants. The answer is meds. And now this new device we've been talking about too, the Monarch, putting electrodes on kids' heads to somehow relieve their so-called ADHD.
Yeah. Let me come back to that in a minute, which is such a disaster. It helps people understand if we talk, I think, just a little bit more about how crazy these views are.
Yeah.
I wanted to say one thing. You mentioned the 20-25-year shortening of life with the major psychiatric diagnoses. I think that is when people are getting the antipsychotic drugs. I think that's what the data is from. But the antipsychotic drugs, as I mentioned, Abilify, Seroquel, or some of the newer ones, Risperidol, Zyprexa, and so on, they are being given to patients without telling them they're antipsychotic drugs. They're being told they're antidepressants because the FDA approved some of them to blunt your depression. I mean, it's all it's going to do is crush feelings. Or they're told it's a sleeping med. Many people on Seroquel, quetiapam as a sleeping medication. So they don't even know they're on drugs that we now know are shortening lifespan, like a big chunk out of your lifespan. And why they do that? Well, all these drugs, everything we give to people in psychiatry is a neurotoxin. Specifically a neurotoxin, or it wouldn't work, because the only way our drugs can work, in psychiatry at least, is by poisoning enough brain function to blunt emotions. They all have one common pathway at the end, whether it's Ritalin or the antidepressants or lithium, mood stabilizers, sleeping meds. They all end up over time blunting your emotional functioning, because that's what happens to the brain when it's injured. We lose that fine tuning that you and I love to have together, that sweetness, that caring, that engagement that we have with our partners in life and we love. I was so glad to see your partner on. She's just sweet to see her on the camera getting ready for this show today, because folks, we're using cameras. In case you tuned in late on this live show is also being filmed, and within a day or two after this show, it goes on live, it will also go on my YouTube, Breggin. Just go to Breggin's YouTube, and right up near the top, you're going to see the TV show, and this is number 2. I'm just hoping this will take off and add to the radio show, and also advertise PRN, this great radio network, some more, because my YouTube is pretty big, and I think we'll be adding people. In fact, I know we already are adding people to those who are going to know about the radio show from the YouTube as well. Well, I want to stay for a little bit before we get on to the, this goes to the flow of the show, because before we get on to some of these really bizarre mind control things, which, by the way, it's really is not conspiracy theory. This is going to be the future of psychiatry, folks, and it's going to jump way beyond psychiatry. It's going to jump in a way that we're going to be telling you about that is just beyond belief, and it's stuff you can easily find now on my website and maybe a few others in the world, where we have videos and access to films that are actually showing you these people at work. They've got their little diagrams, what they're going to be doing. They're working with the federal government, and they're bragging about it. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But one of the things about Michael and I is we both were trained for at least part of the time in environments that were insanely wrong. We were trained in environments that did away with the old distinction, which you were hinting at, between a functional problem, meaning it's the function of your psychology, that's not so clear, and an organic problem. And in the old days, when we were younger, that's how doctors, medical people taught. And psychologists, is it organic, like dementia or blow on the head, or is it functional? And we included in that depression, bipolar disorder, all schizophrenia, all the things that weren't neurological disorders were looked at as functional, having no known explanation, but with lots of indications that its roots were in childhood experience. And now, starting somewhere along the line with the DSM-3, they decided that to push drugs, they had to actually do away with the distinction. There's no distinction like that anymore. And we have fakes, not even science, it's it's lying that says that, well, these are similar because probably schizophrenia is biochemical and genetic, and probably ADHD is, it's all nonsense. None of it is. None of it's known to be. And all these things respond to loving care that attempts to help people get over what they've been through in their family life or in some other place in childhood. You had that experience. Talk about what it was like. Let me say one word. I experienced this when I went to Harvard for my training. I'd been at Harvard College. I knew the professors of psychiatry already as a young kid because they had helped us with the volunteer program. They loved it. But when I went to Harvard, it changed overnight to the medical school, to the residency training program. I was a teaching fellow at Harvard. It had changed overnight, and they weren't doing much therapy anymore. They limited it. They had rules. You could only have two therapy patients as a rule. You could only have one psychotherapy supervisor as a rule. And I actually bootlegged. I had 3 supervisors. And we all just didn't talk too much about it to the administrators because they loved supervising me. They thought it was wonderful, that there was a guy who worked with state mental hospital patients for 4 years in college and really knew how to talk to folks. And I had bootleg extra patients, that I talked to, and they didn't really know about that with the administration. But it was horrible because overnight they were now training these people who didn't know anything. They'd gone to be at the Harvard program, you'd gone to Harvard or Yale or some other place, and you'd gotten A's, straight A's in what? Biochemistry, physiology, mathematics. You probably never read a feminist book, a psychology book, a self-help book, a philosophy book. Who had time? I did. I got it. I did that, but I was a real exception going to medical school. And it was sad to see they would never know anything. And they would never learn to be people very much. They were all uptight, especially at Harvard. They were the worst of the worst because they'd come from the best of the best, which was the most energetic in competing with other human beings to get ahead and, delighting in when you saw your lab partner, the guy next to you flubbed his experiment because it would help you get into medical school because it was graded on a curve. It was a nightmare. And I went back to the State University of New York where Thomas Oss was teaching, and eventually they shut that program down because they couldn't have a professor who basically shut it down, basically pushed Zoss into a corner because you couldn't have a program in psychiatry based on a professor who was teaching from his book, The Myth of Mental Illness. and just overturning this system that was saying this is not mental illness, is ridiculous. It's not a disease. Diseases are diabetes, not when you are upset and distressed and unhappy and so on. So what was your experience early on? Give people, because you're going to be coming back on this radio TV show. I want people to know more about you. And what was your early experience?
What comes to mind is my introduction to the medical field was as a medical corpsman in the Army Reserve. And so I was trained to be a medic, kind of an emergency responder. And so when you're around hospitals and people, men who were, suffering physically, that's from a injury or some kind of disease. And then, so I kind of got that as early, like 18 years old, people can really suffer with medical conditions. And then in the 70s, I'm thinking, Peter, I went to work at a state hospital for profoundly developmentally delayed men. The ward I was on, was about 20 guys in there. None of them had developed speech. They had organic brain syndromes. That's real. Some of those genetic syndromes. And so I spent time with those young men who there wasn't a backstory of, causing what their distress was trauma. They might have had some trauma, but they had clearly diagnosed them. They could see the genetic, if someone has Down syndrome or some other Fragile X. Anyway, so that was kind of, okay, that exists. And then fast forward, I started reading R.D. Laing and Carl Jung and Saz and some of the dissidents, and I go, this makes more sense about, my own life and my own family and everything.
Yeah.
And then so finally, I was going to be an Episcopal priest. I had been accepted for the priesthood, and I'd been, the bishop's ring with the wax. I was on my way to seminary and everything. And
I didn't know that, or I forgot if I knew it.
My spiritual advisor told me, he says, Michael, I don't think you should do this. I think you're too rebellious. And I think you'll be happier if you go into psychology. So he kind of, headed me down here to the Bay Area, where I ended up in grad school. And then
he was very kind and generous, because
he was, he cared about me, and he kind of knew what I needed. And so I came down here to grad school about 1979, and went immediately into a part-time job in a private psychiatric hospital. And there's where I really saw the medical model at work, where everyone was medicated. Even back then, it was Thorazine and the tricyclic antidepressants, but mostly it was a locked ward and people who were going through these extreme states. And it was amazing. On the chart, you'd open the chart, and on every front page of the chart, they actually had a red stamp that said, avoid conflictual material. So avoid,
oh my God.
Yeah. So our job there is
avoid conversation.
So basically, they take the meds, they see the psychiatrist. When their insurance runs out, I've saw people get discharged with, nothing, but there was a woman there who had been a therapist in Sweden or something. And I think about the third day, I said, where does the therapy happen around here? She goes, it doesn't, Michael, but you're my friend now. So anyway, one time in a group therapy, in terms of like what was acceptable in terms of processing trauma or whatever, the topic for the group that day, Peter, was, what's your favorite Italian food? So that was the level of innocuous, not wanting to know what happened. Anyway, from there I went to, it was like night and day, to an experimental program that came out of some research at the Agnew State Hospital on first episode psychosis that showed that the group that didn't get the Thorazine had a 70% lower rehospitalization rate than the large group of young men who did in their first episode. So these programs opened in the Bay Area, and I went right into those. And there, at a public hospital, we had a 20-bed ward, unlocked doors. We didn't medicate anyone. That was open for 8 years. So I had a lot of experience being with doing family therapy and always having that perspective of.
Now, what decade is that?
That was, for me, that was 1980.
Yeah. So that's gone now, folks. I mean,
long gone.
It's very important that all of you understand that psychiatry does not progress. Psychiatry is starts out as a means of social control in hospitals. We as psychiatrists, we are supposed to lock up. I never have locked up anybody in my entire practice. But that's what we're supposed to do, and we're supposed to be on the edges of control. And when psychiatry started to break out in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was crushed by the pharmaceutical industry and by the specific needs for public policing by psychiatry. So it doesn't progress. It's much worse now than in the 50s in many ways. When I was in the state mental hospital, I worked with the top Harvard professors creating a case aid program where each student had his own patient. We weren't told you couldn't talk about trauma. This was an alternative. They were looking at alternatives, and I created this program. I went to the head of the psych department at Harvard in a time when students didn't do that. We created a program with him, working with him. Eventually, I set up a class, a course, where each student had their own patient at the hospital. It was just, very psychological, social, therapeutic. It worked. We got most of our patients out of the hospital that we worked with, and we were kids, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. All that is crushed by the government and big business coming together to push this hugely wealthy pharmaceutical empire.
Yeah.
And but then if we look a little further and we have time, we ask ourselves, well, why was I the first psychiatrist to stand up against the lobotomists and psychosurgeons? Why am I still the only psychiatrist that I know of? Mykos, correct me if I'm wrong. I know some of my reform colleagues might say, oh, they're doing a lot, but I don't think so. I'm the only real psychiatrist who is pushing the edge on a shock treatment, going into the courtrooms, doing my best to put an end to this atrocity of putting people into coma by shocking them on their heads, flatlining their brain waves, having them come out of it in a traumatic brain injury state, worse than your ordinary football concussion. And it's done 10 times, 20 times. We have people who've had it 100 times still. So, there is something else going on that I want to approach now with people, which is that I think that psychiatry is also working with government interest in mind control. Now, how far out is this? When I was in the 1970s and I was looking at Harvard psychosurgery programs where they were putting electrodes into the brains of young, mostly old people, but some young, some older people, not old, but also some children. And they were stimulating them, experimenting on them, having them walk around the ward with a receiver on their head that could stimulate them without their knowing it, working with a man who was an outright fascist from Spain, who, forgetting his name now,
Delgado.
Delgado. I got Delgado driven out of Yale and back to Spain. And in that process, I found out that the federal government was funding these Harvard researchers from two sources: a direct grant to NIMH to do the research. That's the political power they had. I didn't know of any other. I've never known of a direct grant to NIMH to give somebody money. It's supposed to be a competitive system. And that this was in tandem with a Justice Department grant. And why? Because these people, Mark Irvin and Sweet, were saying that they could do these things they thought to control ghetto riot leaders. Because not all ghetto people were rioting, so the ghetto rioters, and especially their leaders, had something wrong in their brains. The New York Times was publishing this kind of thing. The Journal of the American Medical Association had a long thing on it back in the 60s, which, so shockingly to me in those days, they actually let me do a long rebuttal in JAMA under the news and discussion section. But now you couldn't do that. I couldn't get that on shock treatment. So there's this long history of government working with these outrageous treatments. Shock treatment was funded to a guy named Cameron, who was a Canadian, but he'd also been a president of the American Psychiatric Association. They were all that close. Cameron had money from the CIA. So we got the CIA funding shock. We have the Justice Department funding psychosurgery. And now we have a very important new evolution, which is this monarch device. And tell people about Monarch, and what I want them to keep in mind is that Monarch was approved to do to children, everything Michael's going to tell you about, on only a 4-week study of 35 children. This makes no sense at all, because this device is going to be used on children, not just for ADHD, but they'll use it for whatever they want, and it's going to be for months and years. But it got pushed through the device division, which is the same one that's involved in approving ECT. It's the same one that never did anything about psychosurgery. This device division that has these very strong links, I believe, outside of the FDA and the government. And so now tell people about the Monarch.
Well, that's something that came on the horizon pretty fast. I hadn't heard that anything like that was even being researched, but apparently they used the same kind of technology that they'd been wanting to use, I guess, in Europe. It's basically for other conditions, but what they came up with was for children between ages 7 and 12 who've been labeled with ADHD, a device that 2 electrodes go above the child's head, and a wire goes down to a cell phone size battery pack that discharges this electricity into the brain all night long. The child is supposed to wear this all night long, and the results that they claim didn't even happen for a month. So apparently a parent is supposed to trust this new procedure on evidence that you may not see anything different in 1 month. And Peter, I'm sure we'll talk about what that difference is. But what stood out to me was the way it was fast-tracked through the FDA and the way they described the zero science, in my view, of how it worked. They in the FDA press release.
This is bizarre, folks.
It was bizarre. It sounded like something, from Madison Avenue. It said, and the Monarch device works by sending electricity to parts of the brain associated with ADHD. There's no science that shows what parts of the brain are associated with so-called ADHD, but for that to be like an official governmental pronouncement.
And what are the parts? They're talking about the whole brain. It goes to the whole brain. The frontal lobes, right? The limbic system. So in other words, go ahead.
Well, and then what was so frightening to me and everyone I've told about this, and you have, is the first so-called adverse events that were reported in the study that were in the FDA report were fatigue, headache, trouble sleeping, jaw clencing, drowsiness, and increased appetite. I drilled down a little further into that and went into the product safety literature, and from the company who creates these, NeuroSigma, says, in addition to those top 5, and they didn't say the ones I'm going to list now are any less frequent. It said, but also lightheadedness, nightmares, tooth pain, rapid heartbeat, poor appetite, stomach ache, nausea, vomiting, frequent urination, constipation, itching, skin rash, and tingling skin. So they're putting this
all in the short term.
All in the short term, and parents are supposed to accept that there may not even be any results where their child is suffering one or all of these effects of this. And then in the product safety information, Peter, it says it's only been approved for 1 month. Please consult your physician for long-term care. So we all know that it's not going to be turned off at 1 month. So basically they're saying this is like an uncontrolled experiment. And I think it's so ominous too, because this is being promoted. I just found out a couple of days ago, there's the manufacturer, NeuroSigma, partnered with a pharmacy chain called Quick Care Pharmacy. You can go down to Quick Care Pharmacy.
This is Quick Care for you.
Yeah. Quick Care Pharmacy and sign up. And they said, we're doing this with Quick Care Pharmacy and other outlets to, get distribution in all 50 states. So I think it's especially frightening to me because, you know, like you and I, we've seen the progression of children who had issues with sitting still. You know, they got labeled with ADHD. When I first started working in the county, there were maybe 5 or 6 children out of 300 or 400 who were on any medication for so-called ADHD. Now we know that 6 million kids have been diagnosed with ADHD and are on these drugs, even toddlers. The CDC sent out an alert that they discovered that 10,000 toddlers under the age of 3 have been diagnosed with ADHD and are on the stimulant drugs. So then to add on this Monarch device, it looks to me like there's just this whole generation of young people. And I loved what you said the other day of what's going to become of them. What's when you start someone on these kind of invasive treatments so young, I think their whole life could be really tragically impacted.
No doubt about it. And there's no doubt that if people don't join us in trying to do something about this, if you go to Breggin.com and you just scroll down a little on my website, you'll come to the children's page link, green ribbon bar that you can hit, and it's also going to say on it join SPAC or something about SPAC, and you'll get it right into the Monarch literature, the scientific literature. We're hoping that people around this country will say, no, I've got some spare time. I'm going to join Michael Cornwall, Peter Breggin, and the people around them. And we're going to do something about this. We'll have local groups. But you can also be working on making sure your children aren't being put on drugs and looking for better alternatives in your community for helping people. And this is what SPAC is going to be all about. And Michael has a dedicated email. And tell folks about that, where they can get in touch with you and start talking to you about what can we do.
It's called SPAC, S-P-A-C, Victory, at Outlook.com. And we've had that up now for a couple of months, and I've got a lot of emails from people really feeling outraged and afraid, but also very supportive of what we're doing, getting the word out. And it's been international. It's been contact from people from all around different countries.
That's good.
Too. Yeah.
Israel, by the way, has now made a device. So, folks, it's going to be international, though I'm sure the first market for their devices, they'll go to the FDA. There's no exaggerating what we're doing to these children. Sleep is supposed to be your time when you reorganize your brain.
Yeah.
And instead, electricity is going to be reorganizing your brain. Now, this is different than shock treatment. This is going to put you into a convulsion, so you're not going to see the damage as easily. I'm working with a neuroscientist who specializes in electricity, having a lot of communication with him. He's doing a lot of research as a volunteer. I'm keeping his name out of the picture right now. And one of the things he's describing is that what happens with a lot of electricity, it's actually going through the face, a lot of it, because it's a weak current, up the nerves. And it travels up nerves that are sending signals down, and it's going up nerves that are bringing signals up. It's growing up nerves that, control everything from your facial movements to your sense of smell and sensation and so on. And it is from there causing along the whole way a chaos of information that is entirely alien to the brain. And he's into computers and stuff, so he thinks of it as misinformation, fractionated information, broken information that is just going to cause chaos in the developing, sleeping brain. It's a disaster. And who knows, since a child's brain is growing, what the long-term effects will be. But I'll make a flat-out prediction. And, if you read my medical books or look at any of my testimony in court, none of the things I've said scientifically has ever been disproven. I've really stayed on target scientifically. I might have some dumb philosophical ideas or whatever, but I really have put my brain to the grindstone on science. The common pathway for all things that disrupt the brain, whether it's a frontal lobotomy, whether it's any of the psychiatric drugs or any other neurotoxin, whether it's marijuana, whether it's blows on the head, concussions, the final pathway of all disruption of the brain, it produces chronicity, and the chronicity's most marked attribute is a loss of engagement with life. Less interest, less connectivity, less love, less passion, less of one's sense of oneself. And it generally falls under the category in scientific literature of apathy and indifference, but it's more subtle than those terms show. I think the best way of looking at it is you just become less engaged. And so you don't even know what's happening to you because you're less engaged. And I've seen people lobotomized who don't have any idea what's happened to them. And I've seen people on marijuana, frankly, over the years, they don't know their memory is impaired. They don't know, they don't think as quickly. And when I'm working with these young Cornell students and Ithaca College students and other young people in Ithaca, when they come off their meds, with careful supervision, family support, they realize, my gosh, when I was on those meds, I wasn't thinking as fast. My mind was becoming less agile. I didn't feel love the way I do again now. So people lose it. I call it medication spell binding. By the way, folks, this is wonderful. I am so enjoying seeing my guest and knowing it's going to go up as a film. This will be, I'll repeat, this being filmed. This will go up in a couple of days as a TV show on my YouTube. You can get to it just by, Googling Breggin YouTube, or you can get to it off of my website, Breggin.com. You can learn so much more about all the things we're talking about. And I want to kind of give you a bit well, I can really actually direct you to the first show, because in the first show I talked about this. We are now going into an era where big money is involved. We may get to that at some point. You're talking to you about the connections between Monarch and a lot of big money influential people. This is part of something very large. This is not part of one little jerkwater corporation that just happened to get the FDA to do no studies at all practically to get their approval. There's something big going on. And Elon Musk, who makes cars that drive themselves and sometimes explode and sometimes run into other people. Elon Musk is behind now what is going to be just billions of dollars being put into getting people to accept implanted electrodes in their brain, that little hair-like things he says in the lectures. You'll find the lectures on my website. He is getting into putting these devices on people's heads. There's no way he's going to be able to easily disconnect them in order to make them so much more powerful wonder people, because they're going to be connected to computers. He talks about this openly. And if you go to the page for DARPA, D-A-R-P-A, or dig enough deeply into it, or if you look at my blog on Elon Musk, you're going to find that guess who is funding his machine? It's a defense organization called DARPA. They're bragging about it. It's the kind of like doing what the Justice and CIA combined used to do with experimenting with cutting-edge psychiatric, psychological interventions, as well as other cutting-edge defense things. And they're talking about how they did this device. And they're also talking about a day when you won't need a device. You'll be able well, you'll have a device on the head but no electrodes, you'll be able to do it. So folks, they are talking about lots and lots of stuff. I think that my radio TV show is going to be a lot more exciting than my radio show was, because when I'm now seeing my guests, I'm talking a lot more. I'm relating. You notice the difference, Michael? I'm more out front and involved, because there you are and here I am. I'm not just listening to my guests. It's going to be much more interactive. And of course, among all my guests, there aren't too many like you who know a lot about the most important threats we're facing. And I'm just going to be talking more and more about the things I see coming down the pike that are going to be really damaging. Michael, more about the Monarch right now that you want to share with folks? I mean, you were describing an era where this is going to be on a lot of kids.
I really believe that, having been there kind of at ground zero.
By the way, and I wouldn't interrupt on the radio, Michael is director of SPAC, and he's doing it with me and Ginger through our nonprofit organization. So we have a way that you can actually donate money to SPAC. It's tax-free. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that this whole evolution of, as Bob Whitaker said in his landmark book about 20 years ago, bad science, bad medicine, and the mistreatment of people. I mean, I think he really nailed it. Of course, hopefully he'd read your books from 20 years earlier.
Well, he said, in one of the radio shows, he said he sat on my knee learning stuff, because he came to our conferences years ago, and he definitely read my books. But
I mean, I think all of us, kind of in the normal world, we've been going to doctors since we were little kids, and our parents took us in for our shots, and we trust the authorities, we trust the doctors, we need them. You go to a doctor sometimes, I do, I get the test results, I look at them and go, wow, I better do something a little different here. So the thought that these medical people could actually not have our best interests at heart, I think it's kind of hard to get most of our heads around. But I saw this progression where these things get operationalized, especially in these county systems where most of the money for so-called mental health care gets spent, through Medicaid, and in California it's called Medi-Cal. So you'd see these things come online. Like I was there, Peter, when the first mention of Prozac ever happened, like there at the public sector. And then it wasn't long until I was seeing this one little boy that I'd seen for a couple of years in foster care. And somehow the social worker said, no, he needs to go see a psychiatrist and try this new Prozac. And I go, no. And within a few days of taking Prozac, he was like completely out of control. I knew what his baseline was, right? So we've seen these things come online. And so what's coming online with this Monarch, it looks, okay, it gets our hopes up. Maybe this will help. But I've seen one disaster after another, whether it was Xanax, this is not going to be like Valium. People will never go through withdrawals with Xanax, really. The first second generation antipsychotics, there's going to be no problems. And there's a huge metabolic syndrome problems, like you said, around that. So anyway, the Monarch device, I think people really need to question whether this is an advance or whether it's a threat. And just to get back to something we were talking about earlier, just last year, you and I were talking about another kind of digital, surreal, almost, Orwellian thing where people take their antipsychotic drug Abilify, and it has a little microchip in it. It goes in their stomach, it hits the stomach acid, it sets off a reaction to the patches they have on their abdomen that's connected to like a Bluetooth device. That sends the information to the physician, whether the person's complying. So I just had the image this morning where someone has that on them. They have that device monitoring their Abilify, sending the information off wireless through a Bluetooth to the monitors. They have the other thing on at night. I mean, I'm the last person kind of in the conspiracy theory. I really am. But when I read some of the stuff about DARPA, I mean, I've heard about that for years. but people should just Google DARPA and read the DARPA, the explanation of
Yeah.
what they do.
Before you even do the critics, just do what they're saying. Before we finish up, we haven't sufficiently let ourselves think about the effect of this on children. This is going to demoralize our kids. We have to come back and talk about that and much more about the Musk and a lot of other things. But imagine now you're a fragile 8-year-old, 7-year-old. They're already saying that's fine. And you're this little kid, and you've been told that you're going to get electricity through your brain because your brain isn't working right, when in fact what it's going to do is ruin your EEG. I mean, right away we're going to see the brain waves are going to go skewy, and that can easily become permanent. But just think about the child who's thinking, what are my friends going to think? It's not a fad yet. Later it will be a fad. Right now, what is he going to be thinking? First they tried drugs, and the drugs didn't make me a good boy. I'm still not a good boy. Then still not pleased with me. Now they're going to put this thing on my head. It's supposed to make me really become a good boy finally. I mean, this can make a grown man cry. This is so terrible.
Especially when you and I know, and maybe we could touch on that just briefly, that the therapy that we've done, for decades is the alternative to, again, that argument of, is it in your brain or is it something in your life? And so that loving, compassionate, trauma-informed, caring therapy that helps families, helps parents, helps kids, it absolutely works. I mean, that's what I practice still in my practice, and you do too.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing it up. And we're gonna see more of Michael, because we have a lot to talk about together. That's what the filming makes me do, where I see your face. Hey, I got a lot to talk with my old friend about. And remember, folks, ADHD is not a disease. It's a bunch of behaviors that annoy teachers. In the extreme, it requires loving discipline. In my practice, it's the one thing I give a guarantee about. If I have one loving parent who's reasonably together and one child who's out of control, I'm not talking about somebody who's psychotic and I'm talking about ADHD kids, that within a week, the child will be getting better, because you're going to be learning to discipline and love. And if it's not even a problem of discipline and love at home, then we got to get a new teacher, a new school. We got to find an alternative, or I'll get on the phone with the teacher and talk about how she can help the kid. We'll get things turned around. Anybody who's labeled ADHD, and if it really fits the criteria, talks out of turn, all those things, stands up too much, whatever, doesn't do the homework, can't concentrate, all that stuff. If that's really the problem, that's just discipline in school, getting a kid engaged in school. None of those children do anything but sit wide-eyed listening to me in a therapy session, and I explain to them, well, my God, you see, there's nothing wrong with you. Well, you're interesting, Yes, that's right. There's nothing wrong with you. You love somebody who's interesting. And let's make your school interesting one way or another. But also, you've been talking back to your mother too in a way that upsets her and you. So we're going to work on that too. And you're just going to be better in a week or two, and things are going to get really fine for you. And often the kids love to come in, but I end up just seeing the mom, or the mom and the dad, hopefully, or grandma, because it's the parents who change children, and they do it wonderfully when they have some instruction. Michael, I'm going to very soon be hearing the music. It has been wonderful to have you as my second show that's going to be on YouTube. You can get to it through Breggin, on Breggin's channel. It's going to be filmed. It's going to be up in a day or two. Thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Bye-bye.